Daria walked slowly through the misty graveyard, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her umbrella tightly, though it did little to shield her from the biting cold that seeped into her bones. Her eyes were fixed on a single headstone ahead, the name etched on it pulling her closer like a magnet. Reaching Jade's grave, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. A young girl knelt before the headstone, her shoulders trembling as silent sobs racked her small body. Her tiny hands were pressed into the damp earth, and the sight sent a shiver down Daria's spine. She took a hesitant step forward, unsure if she should speak. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out softer than she intended. Who are you? Why are you here?" The girl slowly lifted her head, and Daria's breath hitched. The girl's face was streaked with tears, but it wasn't the tears that startled Daria, it was her eyes. There was something in them, something hauntingly familiar, that made Daria's heart clench. Before she could make sense of the feeling, the girl spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "This is my father's grave," she said softly. "Who are you?" For a moment, Daria felt like the world around her had stopped. Her grip on the umbrella loosened, and it fell to the ground with a soft thud. Her chest tightened as if the air had been knocked out of her. "Your father?" she whispered, her voice shaky and unsure. The girl nodded, her gaze steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Jade was my father." Daria stumbled back, her heart racing as the words sank in. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers from the man lying beneath the headstone. How could this be true? She turned abruptly, her mind spinning, desperate to escape the unbearable truth. But before she could take another step, a small, cold hand grabbed hers, holding on tightly. Daria jerked away, her voice sharp and raw. "What do you want?" "Leave me alone." The girl flinched at Daria's harsh tone, her wide eyes glistening with fresh tears. I ran away from the orphanage to see him," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you're his wife. So that means you're my mother, right? Can I come with you? I just want a mom." Daria's stomach churned as a wave of emotions crashed over her: anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't name. Her jaw tightened and she spat, "Don't be ridiculous. You're not my daughter. Find your real mother and leave me alone." The girl's shoulders slumped as she stepped back, tears falling silently. Yet she didn't run or argue. She just stood there, small and fragile, as the rain began to fall harder, soaking them both. Daria couldn't shake the girl's words from her mind as she turned and walked away from the grave. The rain poured harder now, drenching her clothes and mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. Her chest felt tight, her breath quick and shallow. Could what the girl said be true? Was this young stranger really connected to Jade? As she rounded a bend in the graveyard, her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out with trembling hands and stared at the screen. The name flashing on it sent a chill through her. It was the creditor. She hesitated, but eventually answered, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Daria," the voice on the other end said, cold and detached. "Your credit card payments are overdue, and the loans are piling up. If you don't act soon, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Daria's heart raced as the words sank in. Overdue payments. Unpaid loans. Jade had left her with nothing but a mountain of debt and life crumbling beneath her feet. She gritted her teeth, anger bubbling to the surface as she clutched the phone tighter. She ended the call abruptly, her mind racing. Her gaze drifted back toward the grave, where the girl still knelt in the rain, shoulders slumped in defeat. And then, an idea began to form, a desperate, selfish idea that made her lips curl into a sly smile. She walked back to the girl, her steps measured, her voice suddenly calm but calculated. "What's your name?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. The girl blinked up at her, surprised by the change in tone. "DZ," she said softly. "I live in the orphanage nearby." Daria nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together her plan. "Listen, Desi," she said, crouching down to meet the girl's gaze. "I'll take you in. You can come live with me." but you have to behave and follow my rules. Do you understand? Disi's eyes lit up, a spark of hope breaking through the sadness. She nodded quickly, her voice trembling. I promise. I'll be good. I'll do whatever you say. Without wasting any time, Daria finalized the paperwork to adopt Desi. But her reasons had nothing to do with kindness or love. She saw Desi as a way to solve her financial troubles, a pawn in her game to claim support payments and ease the burden of her debts. When they arrived home, Daria's demeanor shifted again. The warmth she had shown at the graveyard vanished, replaced by cold indifference. She assigned Desi a long list of chores, from cleaning the floors to cooking meals. This is your home now, Daria said flatly, so you better make yourself useful. Desi didn't complain. She quietly did as she was told, her small hands scrubbing floors and washing dishes. The house was silent except for the sound of her hard work, a silence that echoed the emptiness inside her. One evening, as Desi was mopping the floor, she accidentally knocked over a bucket of water. The splash startled Daria, who stormed into the room, her face red with anger. What's wrong with you? She yelled, grabbing Desi by the arm and forcing her to her knees. Look at this mess. Clean it up with your filthy hands, you useless child. Desi's tears fell as she apologized over and over, but her words only seemed to fuel Daria's rage. The punishment grew harsher, and Desi's world grew smaller with every passing day. Despite everything, Desi remained silent, her sadness buried deep inside. She longed for the warmth of a real family, but all she had was the cold, unkind world Daria had created for her. Life in Daria's house grew harder for Desi with each passing day. At first, Desi thought she had finally found a place to call home, but it quickly became clear that Daria didn't see her as a daughter. To Daria, Desi was nothing more than a burden, a tool to ease her own financial problems. Daria assigned Desi endless chores, piling task after task on the small girl's fragile shoulders. Cleaning the house, washing the dishes, scrubbing the floors, Desi did it all without complaint. She worked tirelessly, hoping that if she proved herself useful, Daria might grow to care for her. But Daria's heart remained cold, and her anger only seemed to grow stronger. One evening, as Daria came home from work, she noticed a small smudge on the kitchen counter. Her face twisted in frustration. Desi, see? She yelled, her voice echoing through the house. Desi rushed into the kitchen, her heart pounding. Yes, ma'am, she said softly, standing nervously in the doorway. What is this? Daria demanded, pointing at the smudge. Didn't I tell you to clean this counter? I'm sorry, Desi stammered, her hands trembling. I must have missed it. I'll clean it right away. But her apology wasn't enough. Daria's anger flared and she grabbed a nearby rag, thrusting it into Desi's hands. You're useless, she shouted. If you can't even do this right, then what good are you? Desi's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her head down and cleaned the counter, her tears falling silently onto the rag. She wanted so badly to cry out, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. As the days went by, Daria's treatment of Desi became more and more cruel. One afternoon, Desi accidentally knocked over a bucket of mop water while cleaning the living room. The water splashed across the floor, soaking Daria's shoes as she walked in. Daria froze, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the puddle. What is this? She said coldly, her voice low and dangerous. I'm sorry, Desi whispered, backing away. It was an accident. I'll clean it up. Before she could finish, Daria grabbed her by the arm and forced her down to her knees. You call this an accident? She hissed. Clean it up with your filthy hands. Desi sobbed as she wiped the floor with her bare hands, her small body shaking from the force of her tears. But Daria wasn't satisfied. She grabbed Desi's head and shoved it closer to the puddle, her voice dripping with venom. Look at this mess. This is what you are, a dirty little thing that can't do anything, right? Desi's heart broke a little more that day, but she didn't say a word. She swallowed her pain just as she always did, and continued to do as Daria demanded. One night, as Daria returned from work, she noticed Daria sitting on the floor in the corner of the living room. The sight of her, small and quiet, only seemed to ignite Daria's anger. Why are you sitting there like that? She snapped, grabbing her handbag. Do something useful for once. Before Desi could respond, Daria swung her handbag at her, striking her across the shoulder. The blows came fast and hard, each one accompanied by words that cut deeper than the pain. Why did Jade betray me for a filthy little girl like you? Daria screamed, her voice filled with years of bitterness and rage. What does someone like you have that I don't? I could have had a child of my own, a perfect child. But no, mine is gone, and I'm stuck with you. Desi tried to curl into herself, shielding her small frame from the blows, but she couldn't block out Daria's words. They echoed in her mind, each one like a knife to her heart. When Daria finally stopped, she grabbed Desi by the arm and dragged her to the storage room. This is where you belong, she said coldly, shoving her inside. Stay here and don't come out until I say so. She slammed the door, leaving Desi alone in the dark, cold room. A mouse scurried past her feet, and Desi hugged her knees to her chest, trembling with fear. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, but she felt trapped by her fear, her sadness, and the overwhelming sense that no one would ever come to save her. As the hours passed, Desi noticed the door was slightly ajar. Gathering her courage, she pushed it open and stepped out into the hallway. Her heart raced as she crept into another room, a room she had never been allowed to enter before. Inside, Desi found a world completely different from the rest of the house. The room was warm and beautifully decorated, with a pink bed and a soft, shimmering dress hanging on the wall. Desi's eyes widened as she reached out to touch the dress, her fingers brushing against the fabric. For a brief moment, she felt a spark of hope, a longing for a life that could have been hers. She slipped the dress on, spinning around in front of the mirror, pretending she belonged in this beautiful room. But the moment was shattered by the sound of Daria's furious scream. "What are you doing in here?" she yelled, storming into the room. "Who gave you the right to touch my daughter's things?" Daria's rage was a whirlwind as she tore the dress off Desi, her voice rising with every word. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, pointing toward the door. Terrified, Desi ran out of the house, tears streaming down her face as she fled into the pouring rain. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away from the pain and the heartbreak that filled Daria's house. Daria stormed through her house, her emotions spiraling out of control. The rain outside pounded against the windows, matching the storm inside her heart. She threw open drawers and swept objects off the shelves, unable to shake the image of DCA standing in her late daughter's room, wearing the dress meant for a child she had never even met. "This is all your fault, Jade," Daria shouted into the empty air, her voice cracking with a mix of anger and despair. She hated him for everything, for dying, for leaving her with nothing but debts, and for keeping so many secrets. Most of all, she hated him for abandoning her when she needed him the most. Open a cabinet. In frustration, a small wooden box tumbled to the floor. It landed with a dull thud, spilling its contents across the room. Daria froze, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a stack of papers scattered on the floor. "What's this?" she muttered, bending down to gather the papers. Her hands trembled as she picked up the first sheet, her eyes scanning the words. At first, they didn't make sense: DNA test results, hospital records, and detailed notes about a child's life. But as she continued to read, the pieces began to fall into place, and her heart sank. The papers revealed a shocking truth. Desi wasn't just a random orphan. She was Daria's biological daughter. The DNA test results proved it without a doubt. Daria felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't be right. It doesn't make sense." But the evidence was undeniable. Among the papers, Daria found a diary belonging to Jade. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read. Each word felt like a knife to her heart. The diary detailed everything from the day Daria found out she was pregnant to the moment Jade had taken their newborn daughter away. He had lied to her, telling her that their baby had died during childbirth. But in reality, he had abandoned the child at an orphanage. Why? Because she was born with dark skin, a trait that came from a recessive gene in Daria's family. Jade had been too ashamed to tell the truth, so he had hidden it from Daria. Daria sank to the floor, clutching the diary to her chest as tears streamed down her face. "My baby!" she sobbed. All this time, she was right here. The guilt hit her like a tidal wave, and she felt as though she couldn't breathe. Memories of how she had treated DC flooded her mind, the harsh words, the punishments, the way she had shoved her into the storage room. She had treated her own daughter like an outcast, not knowing the truth. "I'm a monster," Daria whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "What have I done?" As she sat there, surrounded by the evidence of her mistakes, a fierce determination began to grow inside her. She couldn't change the past, but she could make things right. She had to find Desi and beg for her forgiveness. Daria sprang to her feet, clutching the papers tightly in her hand. She rushed out of the house, barely noticing the rain as it soaked through her clothes. Her only thought was to find Desi, to hold her and tell her the truth. The first place Daria went was the orphanage, hoping that Desi might have returned there for shelter. But when she arrived, the building was dark and empty, with no sign of the little girl. "Where are you, Desi?" Daria whispered, her voice filled with despair. She got back in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She thought about all the places Desi might have gone, and then remembered the cemetery. "She's with Jade," Daria realized, her heart sinking. She drove recklessly through the rain, her tires screeching as she made sharp turns. Her desperation grew with each passing second, the thought of losing Desi forever clawing at her chest. When Daria finally reached the cemetery, she spotted a small figure huddled near a headstone. Desi was sitting in front of Jade's grave, her tiny frame trembling as she hugged her knees to her chest. Daria ran to her, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Desi!" she called, her voice breaking. Desi looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She scrambled to her feet, ready to run, but Daria caught her by the shoulders and pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," Daria whispered, her tears mingling with the rain. I didn't know you were my daughter." Desi froze, unsure of what to do. She had never seen Daria like this before, so vulnerable, so full of regret. "I read everything," Daria continued, her voice trembling. "Jade lied to me. He told me you had died, but he abandoned you. I didn't know, Desi. I didn't know." Desi's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a small, choked sob. "You mean you're really my mom?" "Yes," Daria said, holding her even tighter. "And I'm so sorry for everything. I've been so terrible to you, and I don't deserve." She yanked your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me another chance. I want to be your mom, the mom you deserve." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then, slowly, Desi wrapped her arms around Daria and buried her face in her shoulder. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daria felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just relief, it was hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. Together, they walked back to the car, the rain still pouring down but feeling a little less cold. Daria held Desi's hand tightly, vowing to herself that she would never let go again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town as everyone gathered at the lawyer's office. The air was tense, and people whispered to one another, their voices filled with curiosity and suspicion. Daria sat stiffly in one of the chairs, her hands clenched tightly together. She couldn't stop thinking about all the strange events that had led up to this moment. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with glasses and a kind face, stood at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but serious. "We're here to read the will of Mr. Jasper Fields, who passed away a month ago. Please listen carefully." The mention of Jasper's name caused a wave of murmurs to ripple through the room. He had been a mysterious man, wealthy but secretive. No one really knew much about him, and now, with his death, everyone was eager to uncover the secrets he had left behind. Desi sat a few chairs away from Daria, her small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized seat. She didn't meet anyone's eyes, choosing instead to stare down at her shoes. Daria couldn't help but glance at the little girl every now and then, guilt twisting in her stomach. After everything she had discovered, she still didn't know how to face Deasy. Before we proceed, the lawyer continued, flipping through a stack of papers. I must inform you all that Mr. Fields left very specific instructions regarding the distribution of his estate. His will is unconventional, to say the least. Daria raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. She wasn't here for money or possessions, she just wanted answers. But as the lawyer spoke, her focus shifted. First, the lawyer announced, adjusting his glasses, to my loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Ellen Shaw, I leave the sum of $50,000 as a token of my gratitude for her years of service. An older woman in the back of the room let out a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The lawyer continued, listing various bequests to different people, small amounts of money, family heirlooms, and other tokens of appreciation. But it wasn't until he reached the final section of the will that the room fell completely silent. And now, the lawyer said, his voice growing heavier, we come to the main portion of Mr. Fields' estate, including his mansion, his business assets, and the majority of his wealth. Everyone leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. To my daughter, the lawyer read, pausing for effect, I leave everything. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations filled the air. Daria felt her heart skip a beat. His daughter? She thought. But Jasper never had children. Did he? The lawyer raised a hand, signaling for silence. Please, let me finish, he said firmly. The room quieted down, though the tension was thicker than ever. Mr. Fields' daughter is Deasy, the lawyer declared, looking directly at the little girl. All eyes turned to Deasy, who looked up in shock. Me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Daria's mind was racing. How could this be possible? Jasper Fields was Deasy's father? But that didn't make sense, not after everything she had learned about Jade and the secrets he had kept. The lawyer continued, pulling out a letter from the stack of papers. Mr. Fields left a personal note explaining his decision. With your permission, I will read it aloud. Desi nodded slowly, her wide eyes locked on the lawyer. The lawyer unfolded the letter and began to read, My dearest Deasy, if you are hearing this, it means I am no longer here to tell you in person. I am so sorry for all the pain and confusion my actions have caused you. You deserve to know the truth. Many years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I fell in love with a woman named Daria, but I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of my choices. When I learned she was pregnant, I allowed others to convince me that the child would be better off without me. I abandoned you, Dissy, and I will regret that decision for the rest of eternity. But I have watched you from afar, and I'm so proud of the strong, brave girl you have become. You are my daughter, and you deserve everything I have to give. I hope this inheritance will give you the future I was too weak to provide. Please forgive me. With all my love, Jasper Fields' tears streamed down Deasy's face as the lawyer finished reading. The room was silent, the weight of Jasper's words hanging in the air. Daria felt like she couldn't breathe. The letter confirmed everything she had feared, that Jasper had known the truth all along, but had chosen to stay silent. Her anger mixed with guilt, creating a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't untangle. Desi finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. He was my dad? Yes, the lawyer replied gently. And he wanted you to know how much he loved you, even if he didn't show it during his lifetime. Daria couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Wait, she said, her voice shaking. There's more to this story. Deasy isn't just Jasper's daughter. She's mine too. Gasps filled the room once again, and all eyes turned to Daria. What are you talking about? Someone asked, their tone laced with disbelief. Daria took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. I found the proof, she said, her voice growing stronger. Jade lied to me. He told me my baby had died, but he gave her away instead. Desi is my daughter, our daughter. Deasy's eyes widened as she stared at Daria. You're my mom? Yes, Daria said, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Desi. I didn't know. I didn't know until it was too late. But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to make it right." For a moment, Daisy didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she stood up and walked over to Daria. She looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "Do you mean it?" Desi asked quietly. "You really want to be my mom?" "Yes," Daria said without hesitation. "More than anything." Desi hesitated for a moment before throwing her arms around Daria. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daria felt a glimmer of hope. The lawyer cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. "There is one final condition in the will," he said. "Mr. Fields requested that Daisy's inheritance be managed by her legal guardian until she comes of age." Daria nodded, her grip on Desi tightening. "I'll take care of her," she said firmly. "She's my daughter, and I'll make sure she has everything she needs." Desi looked up at Daria, a small smile breaking through her tears. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. And for Daria, the pain of the past was slowly replaced by the promise of a brighter future, a future where she and Desi could finally be a family. The rain poured down heavily as Daria pulled up to the orphanage. The wind howled, carrying the bitter chill of the storm straight to her bones. She sat in her car for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The feeling of guilt, anger, and confusion twisted inside her. Desi, the little girl who had appeared out of nowhere, was her daughter. The truth was now undeniable. But what did that mean for her? For them? Daria couldn't answer that question, not yet. All she knew was that she had to find Desi. After a deep breath, Daria stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind her. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she pushed through it. She walked up to the orphanage's door, each step heavy with the weight of the situation. It felt wrong to be here, wrong that Desi had ended up here, wrong that Daria hadn't been the one to care for her all along. Inside, the orphanage was quiet. The faint smell of old books and something more unpleasant filled the air. Daria's heart pounded in her chest as she walked through the dimly lit hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Desi wasn't in sight. The door to the office was open, and Daria peeked inside. The headmistress, an older woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, was sitting at her desk, filing papers. She looked up when Daria entered. "Can I help you?" the headmistress asked, her tone polite but distant. Daria felt a knot form in her throat. "I'm looking for Desi," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Have you seen her?" The headmistress frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Desi? She's not here at the moment. She ran away earlier today. Poor thing, she's been through so much." Daria's stomach dropped. "Ran away? Where did she go?" "I don't know," the headmistress replied, shaking her head. "She left in a hurry, and we couldn't stop her. She's a strong-willed girl, that one." Daria didn't need to hear more. She turned on her heel and rushed out of the orphanage, her heart racing. Desi had run away. She had no idea where she could be, but Daria couldn't waste any more time. She ran back to her car, desperate for answers. There had to be a place Desi would go, a place she'd feel safe. The first place Daria thought of was the cemetery. It was the one place Desi had been when Daria had seen her before, the place where they'd met. Daria's hands shook as she started the car and sped toward the cemetery. The rain continued to fall in sheets, the road slippery and treacherous. But Daria didn't care. All that mattered was finding Desi, bringing her home, and making everything right. When Daria finally arrived at the cemetery, the rain seemed to slow for just a moment. She parked her car near the entrance and looked out at the rows of headstones. Her heart pounded in her chest, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, through the mist and rain, she saw her. Desi was standing by Jade's grave, her small figure hunched against the wind. She was soaked, her clothes sticking to her thin frame, but she didn't seem to notice. Her face was turned toward the gravestone, and Daria could see her lips moving, though no sound came out. Daria's heart cracked. She didn't know what to say, how to explain everything that had happened. All she knew was that she had to make things right. Without thinking, she got out of the car and ran toward Desi, the rain pouring down on her. Desi didn't notice her approach until Daria was right behind her. "Desi!" Daria called out, her voice breaking. DC turned around, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daria didn't know how to answer. All she could do was reach out and pull DC into her arms. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." DC didn't push her away. Instead, she clung to Daria, her small hands gripping tightly at the fabric of her coat. "I don't know what to do," Desi whispered. "I don't know where to go." Daria held her tighter, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't have to go anywhere, DC," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to be alone anymore. I'll take care of you. I promise." Dissy pulled back slightly, looking up at Daria with wide eyes. "You really mean it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Daria said, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't realized she could feel. "You're my daughter, and I'll never let you go again." For the first time since they'd met, Desi smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was a smile, and it was the most beautiful thing Daria had ever seen. The rain began to slow, as if the world itself had decided to give them a moment of peace. Daria looked down at Desi, her heart full of a promise she intended to keep. She would take care of Desi. She would protect her, love her, and never let her go again. And for the first time in a long while, Daria felt like maybe, just maybe, she had done something right. Daria's heart pounded as she sped down the wet, slick roads. Her car swerved slightly, the tires screeching on the icy pavement. She wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All she could think about was finding Deezy, bringing her back, and fixing everything. The rain came down in sheets, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. But Daria didn't care. She wasn't even sure if Deezy would be at the cemetery. But the thought of her little girl, her daughter out there alone in the storm, made Daria's chest tighten with fear. Deezy had already run away once. What if she did it again? What if she was too far gone? The thought terrified her. Daria's mind raced as she drove, each second feeling like a lifetime. What had she done? Was it too late? Was it possible to fix the damage she'd done? And then, just as Daria felt the despair creeping in, she saw it. Through the rain, she could make out the silhouette of a small figure standing by the grave. Desi. Her heart skipped a beat. There she was, standing alone in the storm, just like she had been when they first met. Desi wasn't running anymore. She was standing still, staring at Jade's grave. Her little body was shaking from the cold, but she didn't move. She seemed lost, broken in a way that Daria couldn't ignore. Without thinking, Daria slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park. She was out of the car before it had even fully stopped, rushing toward Desi, her feet slipping on the wet ground. "Desi!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the sound of the storm. Desi didn't turn around. She just stood there, her shoulders hunched. The rain pelted her skin, but she didn't seem to notice. Daria reached her, her breath coming in heavy gasps. She had never felt this desperate in her life. She reached out and grabbed Desi's arm gently. "Desi," Daria whispered, softer this time. "I'm so sorry. I've been terrible to you. But please, please don't be like this. Come home with me." Desi's eyes flickered up to meet Daria's, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The storm still raged around them, but the world had gone silent. "I don't want to go back," Desi whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. Daria's heart sank. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud was something else. "Desi, please," Daria pleaded, stepping closer. "I know I've made mistakes. I've hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I want to fix it. I want to make things right. We're family now." Desi's face remained blank, her small frame trembling in the cold. She didn't respond right away, and for a second, Daria thought she might never say a word again. But then, very slowly, Desi's hand reached out and grasped Daria's. The touch was gentle, unsure. "I'm scared," Desi said, her voice small. What if you don't love me?" Daria felt her chest tighten. "I love you, Desi. I do. I promise you that." Desi nodded, though doubt still clouded her eyes. I just want to feel safe, she whispered. Daria's heart shattered. This little girl had been through so much, and Daria had been the one to hurt her. She couldn't fix everything in one moment, but she could start by being the mother Desi deserved. Daria pulled Desi into a tight embrace, feeling her shiver against her. You're safe now. You're home. And I'll never let you go again. Desi looked up at her, her eyes filled with the barest hint of hope. You mean it? I mean it, Daria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The storm still raged around them, but for the first time in a long while, Daria felt something that resembled peace. Desi wasn't just a girl she'd adopted. She was her daughter. And Daria was going to make sure she would always be there to protect her.